Welcome back to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today, we're talking about one of the most controversial presidents we've ever had in our history, Andrew Jackson. So, the essential question for this lesson really is Andrew Jackson the champion of the common man, as he claimed to be, or is he more King Andrew, had his own agenda, and of course, followed through with that? Again, we're going to go ahead and observe that today. So here's our first known painting of Andrew Jackson. This is when he was a general during, of course, the most famous battle of his career, the Battle of New Orleans, which happened after the War of 1812. Now, Jackson does go up for the presidency after James Monroe in 1824. When he does, he's up against some pretty stiff competition. You've got Henry Clay, you've got John C. Calhoun, William H. Crawford, who's not pictured, and John Quincy Adams, who of course is John Adams' son, and was the Secretary of State in the previous administration under James Monroe. So now we go and think, 1824, what's going to happen here? Well, Henry Clay actually drops out of the race, allowing, of course, Jackson to campaign from the stump, as they say, campaign to the common man, in which he does. And because he's the common man's ticket, again, that's what everyone's going to be referring to him as, especially farmers are going to be really big into him just because he appealed to them and what they wanted. Here you have his famous nickname comes out from this time. Again, firm, united, let us be, rallying around our hickory tree, as his nickname was Old Hickory. So the election of 1824 was a complete mess. We had four candidates, again, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. William Crawford did suffer an illness during the election, so he is out. Henry Clay came in fourth, so he dropped out. And so it really does come down to essentially Jackson and John Quincy Adams. The issue here is that Andrew Jackson wins both the popular and the electoral vote. He's pretty much on his way into office. But he didn't win by majority. Instead, he won by something called plurality. And plurality means that, he had the most votes, which he did, but he didn't have the majority of the votes. The majority would be over half. Because of that, what ends up happening is this whole decision comes down to, our 12th Amendment. The House of Representatives now has to decide how they're going to proceed. And they actually, believe it or not, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. So he goes ahead and decides each state will get one vote. So Jackson, screaming bloody murder that he won and he shouldn't have to do any of this, doesn't actually go ahead and sell himself to the people who are going to go ahead and cast their vote. Again, one vote per state. In the end, Adams did, again, go ahead and talk to these representatives and said, hey, vote for me. This is why you should. This is why you shouldn't vote for Jackson. And in the end, because of that, you have Quincy Adams winning with 13 states voting for him. So what's interesting here is that, of course, technically Andrew Jackson won this election. He won the popular vote and he won the electoral vote. However, because he didn't get the majority of the electoral votes, it was brought down to the House of Representatives. Here's where it gets a little bit, dicey. We have Henry Clay meeting with John Quincy Adams privately prior to that final vote in the House of Representatives, where again, each state only got one vote. There we start to see something interesting, is because what happens just months after this whole election goes down. John Quincy Adams goes ahead and appoints Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. That's a promotion. Remember, Henry Clay's the one that went ahead and decided that the electoral votes would count. Mainly the reason why John Quincy Adams was president. So a lot of people call this the corrupt bargain, which it really was possibly a corrupt bargain. We don't know if anything was made, any bargain was made prior to this, where, you have, essentially John Quincy Adams go to Henry Clay and say, hey, make me president and I'll make you Secretary of State. We don't know what happened behind those closed doors. All we do know is that John Quincy Adams faces 4 horrible years as a president. He's only going to serve 1 term, and man, it's going to be a bad one. He does suffer from a lot of issues, mental issues, including he does go ahead and lock himself in the Oval Office for, in some cases, days at a time, not talking to anybody. Many Americans didn't see him as our president because, of course, they didn't vote for him. They voted for Jackson. And many saw Adams' vision as a very strong government, very much a strong central government to essentially, stamp out individual liberties, to stamp out your rights. And what we see here is that John Quincy Adams really does try to follow in his father's footsteps. The problem is that, of course, he's not as well received, and just like his father, John Adams, he wasn't well received either. So, although he tries to almost mend, the legacy that is his father's, it's not very successful for him, unfortunately. However, he does go for the 1828 election. It's going to be Adams versus Jackson. And here we have Jackson going ahead and campaigning with Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, which will eventually be his vice president after a certain thing we're going to talk about. He's going to create the Democratic Party. In fact, this whole era was really known as the Jacksonian democracy. Because, again, Jackson was a huge influence in creating that Democratic Party. It's really the old remains of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. These guys are the ones that gravitated towards Andrew Jackson, again, being common farmers. So in this particular election, we're going to see a lot of mudslinging. That's when you see, essentially, both candidates kind of wear each other down with insults, some true, some not true, in order to go ahead and make them look better. So he also gains, again, that nickname, Old Hickory still. It continues right into this election. A big part of why Jackson will win this election, spoiler alert, is because the voting requirements were lowered. You used to have to own land, a certain amount of land, and be a white landowning male in order to vote. Now you just have to be a white male. So this, of course, is not only just a bigger amount of people that could vote, but now we've also got, as crazy as this sounds, we've also got, people who are even more the common man voting for Jackson because, well, they may not own land, but they can still vote now. So again, Jackson wins by a landslide in the 1828 election, as you can see here. It's not even close. And of course, what we're going to start to see as well during this time is the population starts to move out west. We're going to talk more about this later in our different virtual classrooms, but essentially this is a big, big part here of really U.S. history as well. So we got the new Jackson coalition that joins us here, right? So Jackson goes into office and uses what we call the spoils system. Now the spoils system is essentially something that kind of comes out of the old William Marcy Tweed or Boss Tweed of New York, where to the victor belong the spoils, right? He won, so he should be able to do whatever he wants, including go ahead and appointing his friends. Imagine this. Imagine Lil Wayne gets elected president, right? He goes and he appoints his crew, right? Drake, Nicki Minaj, and all that, and the rest of Young Money as the cabinet, right? And fires everyone else who was there. Do you think that's right? Why or why not? It's a very interesting question. Like, when you have a president, like, is it okay for them to literally clean house and fill it with their friends and supporters? The cabinet, these cabinet positions. So Jackson did just that. He comes into office, throws out all the former appointees, and replaces them with his friends and supporters. And that's what the spoils system is. Incoming officials throw out the former appointees and replace them with their own friends and, of course, supporters. In addition, we have the reign of King Mob, as it's known. He goes ahead, he throws a huge party in the White House. We have over 10,000 people in attendance. We have a gigantic block of cheese, and we have all this wine and everything else everywhere. In fact, it was very famously the punch bowl was spiked, so someone had spiked it. So in order to get people out of the White House, because they were destroying the place, in fact, it reeked of cheese because it got into all the rugs for weeks, as people had claimed. So they moved that punch bowl outside just to get everyone out of the White House. The problem was, he said he wanted to go ahead and party with the common men, the people who got him elected. He didn't expect 10,000 people to show up to the White House and go ahead and party. So it was a huge disaster for sure. So Andrew Jackson's now our president, and already he starts to cause waves. He very much is a very controversial president. First is the House, he votes into the House the Tariff of Abominations. What this does is essentially goes ahead and puts a tax on imported goods. This was meant so people can go ahead and buy American goods instead because it would make them cheaper. But those American goods were already very expensive. So now instead of having the cheap imported goods that were pretty cheap, now they have a tax on it and everyone pays that tax. So because of that, those really expensive American goods now are the only real option to buy. And so as you can see, the North loves it because of course that's where everything's being made now, the industrial North. The North has all the factories. The South hates it because now they have to buy from the North. And so this becomes a huge controversy between the two. Again, favors the North, hated by the South. And this is something that ends up growing into really what we call nullification. The state of South Carolina goes ahead and argues for nullification. They basically say that if there is a law that the state doesn't agree with, they should not have to follow it. This gets blown into the Webster-Hayne debate. Essentially, John C. Calhoun, who is the vice president to Andrew Jackson, goes ahead and says, we will not follow these tariffs because they're unconstitutional. Again, that's what nullification is, that a state should have the power to nullify a federal law if they find it unconstitutional. The debate ensues. Jackson goes ahead and was definitely for the tariff, and Calhoun, his vice president, was not. Calhoun resigns, and for a year we actually have, or really for a time, we don't have an actual vice president because Calhoun quits, and eventually Martin Van Buren will be his vice president. So South Carolina is so mad, they start to threaten to secede right here and now, meaning leave the country. We could have had civil war right here. However, what ends up happening is Congress gets persuaded to go ahead and pass the Force Bill Act. Now the Force Bill Act goes ahead and allows the government to use the Army and Navy against South Carolina if they resist to pay their taxes. So really, Jackson goes ahead and says, we will send the Army down there if you don't pay your taxes. And so Henry Clay, the great compromiser, goes ahead and smooths everything over by proposing a tariff that would eventually, over time, go down. And of course, that is what is accepted, and Henry Clay saves the day. It's crazy to think just how close we were to South Carolina leaving the Union right here and now. And what Andrew Jackson says to Calhoun after he resigns and after all of this here, he goes ahead and he says that if he ever sees John C. Calhoun, he will hang him from the first tree he sees. So, obviously Henry Clay, there's political cartoons that come out. Here Henry Clay is sewing up Jackson's mouth because he's saying things that's really going to get everyone in trouble. Now, Andrew Jackson is well known for not being friendly towards Native Americans. What you're about to see is some of the most horrible and heinous acts that a president has done against especially the Native Americans here during the 1800s. So what Andrew Jackson does is he decides he wants to remove a certain group of Native Americans out of the north part of Georgia. It's called the Cherokee Nation. This is called Indian removal, and in fact he's going to help Congress pass an act, the Indian Removal Act, to relocate Native Americans to what they're called the Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. Now, it doesn't have really good fertile land, and essentially he's going ahead and taking this land from the Native Americans, essentially saying, hey, we're going to take your land because it's very fertile, it's very good for growing crops, especially cotton right now, which is blowing up. So we're going to take Native Americans there, we're going to take you, we're going to put you out in Oklahoma in some horrible land. Taking them off the land of the ancestors, where their dead are buried, and moving them into a much horrible land. This is horrible that he does this. And in 1830, it actually goes through until the Cherokee Nation takes it to the Supreme Court. And when they do, they win. Yes, the result is that the Cherokee Nation goes ahead and wins recognition as a community and that Georgia cannot take their lands. The ruling was by Chief Justice John Marshall. Unfortunately, very famously, Jackson says John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Jackson forces those Cherokee to sign a horrible treaty, the Treaty of Nuikota, in that treaty, it forces them to leave their lands, sell it to the federal government for $5 million, and move out west. Absolutely horrible. Now here's the Cherokee Nation. This is where they're all located right here, where their land is. Right, as you can see, right at the northern border of Georgia, southern border of Tennessee, Alabama, a little bit there too. They're not the only nation. In fact, there's going to be about 5 tribes, and even some others too, but 5 of the main tribes here are going to be forced into this Indian territory. That's the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. They're going to go across land, with the exception really of some of the Creek and the Seminoles are going to use the Gulf of Mexico. And they're going to make this trek, and it's going to be one of the most dangerous treks in history because it's called, as you may have heard, it's very famous, unfortunately, the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is this journey where we have 16,000 Native Americans forced off their land, forced to go across into this new horrible land of Oklahoma here, where 4,000 Native Americans will die making that journey. That's a quarter of them. It's absolutely horrible. They die because of hunger, disease, being robbed by bandits. It's horrendous. And again, it's all because of that Indian Removal Act. Another thing that comes up during Jackson's presidency is his use of federal power. He goes ahead and vetoes the renewal of the bank, the Second National Bank, the bank charter. And this basically puts in a huge debate between Nicholas Biddle, who's this kind of arrogant aristocrat from Philadelphia, as that's where the Second National Bank is located. It's still standing today. However, obviously it's not functional, as you'll see. And Jackson. Jackson doesn't believe in the national, not only does he not believe in the national bank, he doesn't believe in paper money. He's all about what they call specie, or coins, hard currency. And so he says, okay, we're going to totally dissolve this bank. We're going to put the money into little pet banks, little special banks, essentially throughout the U.S. And because he vetoes the extension of the Second National Bank of U.S.'s charter, it crumbles. It crumbles. It literally does. The bank goes bankrupt. This is going to lead to some economic downfall as well during this time. It's really, really kind of crazy when you think about it. It's this very famous, him publicly taking down the bank. And this is where we get to our first essential question. In 1832, we have this very famous cartoon, you've been seeing at the edge of the screen as well, of Andrew Jackson dressed as a king, and of course stepping on the Constitution of the United States. And so many started to see him as King Andrew because he abused his power. Do you think he abused his power? I mean, a lot of people do. And honestly, when you think about what he did with the Native Americans, taking down the bank, amongst other things, some would argue that he did maybe go a little too far, for sure. Now, in 1836, we do have another election. Obviously, 2 terms have been served. Granted, the amendment wasn't in yet, but Jackson does step down. Again, Washington did it, so he set that precedent. And Old Kinderhook, or OK, he's OK. Which is kind of where a myth is that we may have gone ahead and gotten the term OK from Old Kinderhook here. He is going to win this election, which is going to be split. As you can see, the Whig Party is going to be split, which is going to split their vote. So if you add up their votes, that definitely could have made some sort of difference. But in the end, Van Buren wins with 57.8% of the electoral vote and 51% of the popular vote. He is from New York, Old Kinderhook. It's actually right over the border of Massachusetts. His house is beautiful. It's still there. You can take a tour of it. It's fantastic. But again, his presidency does start off with the Panic of 1837 because of various reasons, like the National Bank closing. So because the Panic of 1837, which again, part of it was because of the Second National Bank not being rechartered, again, it really does bring in the worst depression this country had seen up to this point, where this picture kind of tells it all, where, we see so many people that are going to be homeless, there's going to be so much unemployment, and it's going to stretch far and wide. It spreads really, really, really quickly. But does Andrew Jackson care? No, he's in retirement. He's done. That's it. Again, we don't really hear much from Jackson after this. In fact, his house is still there as well. It's in Tennessee. And what we see, of course, is that, well, at the end of the day, he's done. He's done. He's did all that damage and left it in Van Buren's hands, Martin Van Buren. So a couple fun facts about Jackson. He had 2 bullets lodged in his body, kept them as souvenirs during duels. On the last day of his presidency, he says he had 2 regrets. He was unable to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun. His favorite food was pancakes, loved flapjacks. Richard Lawrence actually attempted to assassinate him. That's one of the times. He pulled out one gun and misfired, pulled out another one, that misfired. So Jackson actually tackled him to the ground and beat him. Jackson actually had a scar on his arm and his face because a British officer had gone ahead during the Revolutionary War when he was young and struck him with a sword. So he actually did have that scar. His wife Rachel unfortunately died a month after he was elected president. There was a lot of that mudslinging we didn't get into, but essentially John Quincy Adams his people called Jackson's wife Rachel a lot of very not nice names, we'll say, and a lot of that's because of she was still married technically under the law to her former husband, who wouldn't sign the divorce papers when she married Jackson. So a lot of controversy there. Nevertheless, he had 11 kids altogether. None were his own. 2 were Native Americans. He killed Charles Dickinson, not that Charles Dickinson, but a different Charles Dickinson, not the author, in a duel after he insulted his wife and accused him of cheating on a horse race. So Dickinson left a bullet near Jackson's heart during this. Dickinson's shot hit for the rest of his life. And as he clutched his chest going down to his shot, he shot Dickinson and killed him. But Jackson lived. Jackson again had a 1,400-pound block of cheese at his famous inauguration party. The cheese was all caught into the carpets and stunk up the place for weeks. He had a parrot named Pole. It was removed from his funeral though because Pole was saying was cursing too much, saying very inappropriate things. He was also almost assassinated in 1833. He was attacked by a former Navy officer on a boat, and what he did was he caught the plan was foiled. He caught him and beat him with his cane. So again, our last photo of Andrew Jackson is right here, 1 year before his death. Again in 1844, this is where the picture is, and he dies in 1845. Now Andrew Jackson really is one of the most controversial presidents we've ever had, and in the last 20 minutes you definitely can see that. So what do you think? Do you think that history should paint him differently? And of course the most at least at the time of recording this, one of the most interesting things we're seeing is he's currently on the $20 bill. However, maybe not for long. All right, so thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you guys back in the classroom.